Hey everybody, Mr. Lane here. Talk about modes of selection and speciation. More or less what we just talked about on the awesome sauce POGL that we just finished. So pay close attention. If it didn't make sense in the POGL, it should make sense after these notes. So here we go. First, we have to talk about single gene traits. This is going all the way back to our homeboy Gregor Mendel, who was looking at those just single gene traits. Remember, it was either tall or it was short. It was purple or it was white. It wasn't the spectrum. So single gene traits, nature is going to select one or the other. So the relative frequency of that allele in the population is going to be a percentage. So it's either, let's say, 40% the white allele in this case, or 60% the black allele. So when we look at this graph, we're going to be using a bar graph for single gene traits. And if you look here, this makes sense because if you are a predator flying over this here tree, you're going to see this white moth on this black background much more easily than you are going to see this black moth on the black background. So what that's going to do is going to favor those black alleles over those white alleles. All right, so bar graph for using that single gene trait. Conversely, polygenic traits, let's break that word down again. Poly, we know the prefix poly means many, and genic is referring to genes. So polygenic literally means many gened traits. These are traits that are covered by more than one gene. These lead to phenotypes that exhibit a bell curve. So when we say bell curve, well, here's about as classic as it gets. These are different heights from people apparently back when there was still no color photography. The shortest little dude over here is a little measly 4'10", and the tallest dude's at 6'2". But most people are right here in the middle at 5'8". So he makes this nice, perfect little bell curve because all of these traits that are determining for height are controlled by many different genes. And down here we see that same with this example here, that we see this random bell, or not random, we see this bell curve with a median average trait. So, natural selection can affect polygenic traits in different ways. Unlike the single gene trait where it's either one or the other, it's going up or it's going down, polygenic traits, because they have this bell curve, natural selection can act in three different ways. The first is directional, and then stabilizing, and then disruptive. As we go over these, think about what the word is telling you. Directional selection, it's going a direction. Stabilizing, it's making it stable. And disruptive, you're breaking it apart. All right, so here we go with directional selection. Directional selection is when individuals at one end of that bell curve have an advantage over the others. So there is selection against one extreme, and there is selection for the other extreme. What this is going to do is going to shift the entire curve one direction or the other. If we go back to the example of height, for example, if let's say there is some type of selective event where really, really tall people like myself get selected against the whole population, those genes for making redonkulously tall people would be cut right out, and it would then favor the shorter people. So let's say, like everybody has to drive compact cars and like people that are tall can't, sit in the back seat or something. Therefore, they can't pass on their genes. That's going to select against them. I don't know. Maybe that works. Another example of this would be like bird beaks. You can look at bird beaks, and if they are using, they have to use their beaks to open food and such. If they're opening very large seeds, they need very large beaks. That's annoying. With those large seeds, they have to have large beaks. If you have a very small beak and you can't open that big old honking seed, you die. So that's going to favor a larger beak size in the population as a whole. And we'll talk about this with the Peter and Rosemary Grant studies in the Galapagos when we get back to class. So that's directional selection. It's favoring one extreme over the other, shifting the whole population toward that favored extreme. Stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is when individuals that are at that median are favored over the extremes. That natural selection, the environment, is selecting against both extremes. So now we're selecting against both extremes. Best example of this one is birth weight in humans. Birth weight and crown size, which is like the measure around your head. Very, very stabilized in humans. And this makes sense, right? If you are born and you are like a pound, you have a very low chance of surviving naturally. Yes, due to modern medicine, and we have the NICU, we have all this amazing technology that can help premature babies be born, but in the real natural world, they would not survive. Conversely, if you have like a 20-pound baby with like a 20-inch crown coming out, that's not only going to kill the mama, the baby's not going to survive either. So this selection is selecting against the gigantor babies, but it's also selecting against the very small babies. That's why most kids who are born are selected in a very narrow range for birth weight and for crown size. So that's called stabilizing selection. And the final one is just the exact opposite. It is disruptive selection. Here we are favoring both of those extremes while selecting against the norm. So this is probably the most easy one to see how speciation could occur. You can see that, let's say there is a population of, let's use birds again, that have kind of medium-sized beaks. Some of the population have large beaks. Some of the population have small beaks. Something happens to that the population of trees and seeds that they're eating, that there aren't any more medium-sized seeds, that there's only really small seeds and there's only really big seeds. What that's going to do is favor those natural variants that have large beaks and those that have small beaks, while selecting against those that have the medium beaks, because they're being outcompeted by those with the large and the small bills. So disruptive selection favors the extremes while selecting against the median. All right, so directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. Cool. Let's talk speciation now. So the process of forming a new species is what we call speciation. A species, it's a box that we have created. I will tell you that in reality, there is no such thing as a species per se. It is a nice, clean little box that humans have created because we like to put things in categories and we like everything to be nice and organized. But nature doesn't really care about organization. So when I say species, what I am referring to is simply a group of organisms that breed with one another and produce fertile offspring. That's how we have defined it. We'll get into the philosophy of that later. The number one thing that needs to happen if you are going to have a species is that they have to produce those fertile offspring. That means babies that go on to make more babies. So if you want to make a new species, the first thing you got to do is make sure that they're not breeding together. So that's what we call reproductive isolation. There's members of the population that can't breed with each other, then they can't pass on those genes. That means they can't make offspring. And ultimately, over time, what this can lead to is the formation of new species. The example that I like to think of is wolves, Canis lupus. Canis lupus is genetically compatible with domestic dogs, Canis lupus familiaris. But I will tell you, if you take this little useless bag of flesh that we call a chihuahua, and we put it with a wolf, yes, they hypothetically could breed together, but is a wolf going to breed with a chihuahua? No, that's not going to happen. That wolf is going to eat said chihuahua. You're not going to have this cute like wolf-chihuahua hybrid running around or something like that. No, even though they are genetically compatible, they are not capable of breeding for behavioral reasons. First off, the wolf will eat it, or mechanical reasons. If you have a male wolf and a female chihuahua, for mechanical reasons alone, they are not going to be able to breed. Really, by our definition of species up here, you could almost consider a chihuahua and a wolf as a species, but we won't get into the details of that right now. So the first isolating mechanism is what I referred to earlier as behavioral isolation. Ladies, you know all about this. Every time you go to the dance, you always have that one dude that's like out there and he's just like busting a move and you're like, what is his problem? I don't like those moves at all. You know it. That's behavioral isolation right there. There is no chance that he will be passing on his genes because of the way he is behaving. The best way to think about this is birds. The peacock. If you look at the peacock here, he has this giant frill, and he's out there trying to impress the ladies. He's like, what's up, ladies? And he's shaking his feathers, and those peahens, that's what you call the female peacocks, they're looking, does he have the moves? Does he have a nice color? Do they have nice full feathers? Imagine if you are the peacock that has like kind of the janky feathers and he's like, what's up, you want to mate? That peahen is not going to be like, whoa, you clearly cannot take care of yourself. I do not want to have your genes passed on through my generations. So this behavioral isolation is what we call sexual selection in birds. They have to do the dance just right. That dance usually represents something about their overall health and their ability to be parents or fathers. And if they aren't right, the ladies will say, The other example here is the blue-footed booby, and this is the male right here. He is doing what I call the blue-footed booby dance, where he just lifts up those feet and he's got that move going on, and she's just kind of looking like, I don't know, not sure, and he is trying his little heart out, trying to impress her. So guys, remember that Y chromosome? This is why you do those things you're doing. You are trying to have the right behaviors in order to pass on your genes to the next generation. Second one here, isolating mechanism, is what we call geographic isolation. This one makes clear sense because if two members of the same species are not in geographical contact with each other, they can't breed to make babies. Great example here of salamanders. Man, salamanders are super cool. You have this original population of salamanders that originated up in the Pacific Northwest. As it spreads south, it goes around the Sierra Nevada mountain range. As it spread around the mountain range, speciation events occurred. So what we actually see is that this species up here is kind of the ancestral species for all of these species of salamanders here. And that on one side of the mountain range, you have a different species, but very closely related species of salamander than the other side. And this makes sense because a salamander that's like this long is not going to scale the mountainous peaks of the Sierra Nevadas, make it all the way over the snowy summits, all the way back down into a valley just to find a mate. Simply not going to happen. So what we have here is a great diversity of different salamanders based on that geographic distribution. So because they are separated by in this case, a mountain range, they've formed new species. That the variation found in the population that originally came to the east side of the Sierra Nevadas is different than the variation found in the west side. Ultimately, that has led to the formation of two new species. And the final is temporal isolation. Temporal is referring to time. This could mean that if you are a very closely related species, but one is only awake during the day, it's diurnal, one's only awake at night, they're never going to meet. Flowers are a great example of this. If you are a flower that this is when I'm open for these 2 weeks, but this flower is open for these 2 weeks, there's no way that they're going to be able to exchange pollen. The example that I have here is with the spring field cricket and the fall field cricket. You may look and like, those look like the same, Mr. Lane. They're both crickets. But they are two different species. They are two different species because the spring field cricket breeds only in the, as the name suggests, spring. And the fall field cricket only breeds in the fall. So because they have different breeding times, there's no way that the genes between these two different species can mix. And you might be thinking, well, they look like the same species. Well, they look like the same species because they live in the same habitat and they're under the same selective pressures from their predators and the environment. So it would make sense that they would look very similar, despite the fact that they are, in fact, two different species. So that's the overview of everything that we talked about in the POGL. We had the three different modes of selection. We had directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. And then we had the modes of isolation. We had behavioral, we had temporal, and geographic. You should know all three of each of those now. You should be able to use them in sentences and make sense out of them and understand how that could ultimately lead to speciation. And without further ado, here is your moment of monkey. Have a great day, guys. Answer the question at the end here, and we'll see you soon.